Good morning, Tom. We're going to pick up from our interview of last night.
Good morning, Donna.
One of the questions that was submitted to you from one of the forum members, Arthur in the UK, was how does consciousness connect to the body? And you gave a really good answer. Would you like to elaborate on that answer?
Yes, there is one kind of metaphor that I think might help understand that. And when I gave Arthur that answer, it was a good answer in the sense that it's like, well, it doesn't really connect to the body because the body isn't really a body. It's not really physical, so you're thinking about it in the wrong way. That was my answer to him, because one thinks that, all right, here you have this spiritual realm where the consciousness lives, and now you have this physical realm where we live, and how does that non-physical consciousness attach to my physical body? Well, that's just the wrong question, because there is no physical body. You say, that was kind of the answer I gave to him, that you have to look at it in terms of this is all just data and information. It's just a virtual reality that is created through information. So we can take that a little further, though. I've had other people ask me the same question since then, and I came up with a metaphor that seemed to be a little more suitable for getting them to understand it than where I left that answer before with Arthur. And that is, if you look at the video games again as an analogy. I use that a lot, but it actually is a pretty good analogy. The big difference being that those are programmed and our virtual reality just has evolved. But if we look at that, how do you define a character? How do you birth a character in The Sims? Well, you go to, or in the World of Warcraft, you go to some page where characters are created and you pick attributes. Okay? Now you can't just pick any attribute. There are some rules on the kind of attributes you can pick, because otherwise everybody would pick the character with all the most wonderful attributes. And that wouldn't make as interesting a game as if you had a lot of varied characters that were good for different things in different ways, and it becomes a more interesting game that way. So there is a kind of limitation to your picking, but within those limitations you get to pick the attributes and the kind of character. Is it an elf? Is it a barbarian? Is it this or is it that? And within those you can pick, how clever is it? Does it do spells, or is it strong? Or what are its hit points, and so on. And then once you're done, that character then, as you've configured it, becomes an avatar for you, and you can play that character in the game. All right, now let's look at the consciousness part of it, and we'll see that it's very similar. In the consciousness game of physical reality, if you will, and this virtual reality, the virtual reality is evolved. Okay, it's not programmed, it's evolved. So it started with the big digital bang, and I've talked about that in other talks that I've given. And if this doesn't make sense to you, go back and look at those beginning talks, please. I won't repeat all that here. But it starts with the big digital bang, and then this simulation of this reality, which we call physical reality, starts to unfold until you have suns and places like Earth and cells and biology and all that kind of stuff evolves in this virtual reality. Now, this simulation is just simulating potential. It forms the structure according to the rule set that defines this reality frame. All right? Now, so how do we get the consciousness connected to the avatar in the virtual reality? Now, what's that like? Well, let's say that in this simulation, we've let the rule set evolve enough that it has people in it. It has critters and people and bushes and trees and basically our environment here. So all of that in the simulation is just potential, okay? Based on the probability of what is likely to happen given the rule set and the initial conditions and so on. All right, so now you have in this simulation, you'll have a couple who are going to have a child, Now you have that in The Sims as well. You have couples that have children in The Sims. So, this is something you can simulate. But again, this is not programmed. This is an evolved simulation. Well, that child that they're going to have is a potential child, just as they are potential people. There's potential there. Now, you are consciousness, and you'd like to get into this virtual reality experience game. Okay, you're looking for an open slot, right, to get in. Well, you can look at all of the various potentials out there that suit you. Okay, here's a child, and because of the parent A and parent B that made this, that are producing this child, you have a certain genetic set that will give you some limitations. Okay, now these are limitations again in terms of probability. Okay, so you've got some limitations. That's like the character in World of Warcraft. You can't just pick anything. You're limited with the kind of things and combinations and whatever that you can pick. So there's limitations, but within those limitations, there's lots of probability and chance that this might happen or that might happen. So you look at the potential of it and you say, well, okay, this one suits me. Of all of the potentials that are in this virtual reality game, that's a potential that'll suit my next incarnation pretty well, reasonably well. And sure, there's some unknowns to it, and there's some chances, the way things might go together or turn out or experience. You can't eliminate all the variables, right? This is not a deterministic exercise. This is once that you play the game and you take your chances, sort of thing. So what you do then is that you take your own data. Remember, you as a consciousness are also information. You're also memory and experience. All the things you've ever thought, done, said, all the quality you've accumulated up to this time, you can reduce that all to information. Information that describes you uniquely, your experience, your choices. Well, you can take that information and put that information, insert that information into this potential being, just like picking the characteristics of your, virtual avatar in your computer game. So you do that. Now, once you've done that, now your information has become, I don't know what we say, uploaded to, injected into, however you want to say it. This is a metaphor, right? So however you want to put this, into this potential being. Well, now this potential being is born and grows up, and in its larger sense, it is you, because it started with your, it was your data input that was there. So that's kind of how you connect to it. So it has your data input. So it's like you take your data card, like your credit card or something. You take your data card and you put it in the slot, and it downloads your data, into this potential being. And from then on, you work out through this virtual reality the experiences that this potential being will have with other beings and other things in the environment that's in this multiplayer game. But it's you in there because you put your own data as part of the input to it. That's your part of the selection process, just like your part of the selection process in the World of Warcraft is to pick how much hit points. Does this being do magic? What are its characteristics? Well, you get to load your own data. So now this being starts out with a quality of consciousness that you brought to it. That's part of what you download when you stick your own data file into that being. So now you're integrated. That's you now. Okay? And this being, of course, is an infant, and it has to learn how to interpret the data, what all the data means. How do you interpret that? And that's what this infant is doing. It takes this infant a long time just to realize that thing that flies around in front of its face and scratches it sometimes is its own hand. You see, it takes it a while to figure that out. Oh, that's a part of me, and then later, I can control it. And then it spends weeks practicing controlling it until that control gets better and better, and it can kind of, make it go where it wants to, and so on. It has to learn all of the data and how to interpret every piece of data that it gets in its environment. When it sees things, it has to learn to interpret them. Oh, that's mom, that's dad, that's the crib, You know, that's the wall or the ceiling or the mobile I'm looking at. And it learns to, it gets the data, but at first has no idea how to interpret it. It interprets it through experience. It learns and it grows. And after it's, 2 or 3 years old, it knows what room, ceiling, arms, hands, legs, clothes, beds, it has a lot of images now, a lot of input symbols that it can give interpretations to, that it has metaphors, that it has part of its experience base. So that's what it's doing, but at the same time, it's got your input. When you put your data card in there and said, well, this is me, well, that data is loaded in there too. So it sees it not only through its potential ability to see, because it's in this simulation, but it sees it through your own filter of how you should see it and how you would deal with those things and how you would interpret them. You see, so it brings along your quality of conscious, which means it brings along your fear, your ego, your lack of love, because that's the way you are. See, it brings all those things along with it. Or it brings your, great quantity of love, because that's the way you are. So then it becomes a you. So that's kind of the way to look at the process. So then here you are now in this simulation, and it's just a potential simulation, and now there's a character, an avatar in this potential possibilities within the simulation and the interactions with other potential beings that has your fundamental stuff in it. And that becomes you then. And you play that through until this character, gets run over by a truck or gets old and dies or whatever, and then you repeat the process. Except now you've changed because you've learned things, you've grown up. So now the next time you do this, when you bring out your data card, and you want to insert it in the slot to say, I'm going to insert my data into this potential being in this simulation, then it's different. It's a different you. And the next time you make different choices perhaps, different situations. So that's just giving a kind of a, putting your card in a slot, and how it works with the World of Warcraft. It's a little different view of trying to see how is it does this world of consciousness connect with this world of physical, bone and flesh. And remember, this physical world of bone and flesh is just data. It's not real. The physical world isn't real. It's not that, the soul comes into the brain, and then lives in the brain or lives in the body. See, that's thinking, that's ancient thinking, the way, that's why the evil spirit, that's why you have to cover your mouth when you yawn so the evil spirits can't, get into your body. That's kind of an old way of looking at things that didn't turn out to be too useful or too practical. So it's not like that. You don't have a physical body, but there is a personal connection between you and this avatar because it's carrying your own quality with it. And you do that by basically downloading your data into it because it's just a potential being in a simulation. And you kind of put your own stuff in it, if you will, and then it becomes you.
I think it's a very interesting analogy, and it does help to clarify how this virtual reality works. The one thing that, of course, would be different is you're speaking of this analogy. This analogy is a programmable video game. Mm-hmm. It's similar to what we are, but we're an evolving.
We're an evolving game. You see, that's a completely different thing. Like
it is.
We don't
have a limitation.
No, we as consciousness, you see, are very different than our potential characters. We as consciousness are a whole different kind of being than this avatar we're playing on the game. Just like we as conscious beings are very different than that sim character that we play. It's the same thing. We're not that sim character. We're a totally different kind of being than that sim character. Well, that's the way it is with us. We as consciousness are really a very different kind of being than that human that we're playing in this earth, virtual reality in this particular universe. But we think of this physical body, as being the source of things. It isn't. It's just potential in a virtual reality game. Just potential. And if you think of that virtual reality game when you're picking your elf or picking your Sims character, they're just potential too. They're just a potential character. and then you have limitations, but you pick various kind of characteristics and maybe the job they have or some other kinds of things that kind of makes them a specific character. Well, that's kind of the same thing. So we, think of our brain. We think, well, our brain is a processor. It takes in data, it processes, it chooses, it makes the choices. It doesn't do anything. Our brain doesn't process anything, doesn't store anything. You say, well, what do you mean? Of course your brain stores things. You cut out this part of your brain and you can't remember stuff. It has to store things. No, it's not the way it works. The brain doesn't store or process anything. The brain is just a potential. It's a simulation. It's a potential that limits what the consciousness can do. You see? So the reason when you cut that part of your brain out that you can no longer remember these things is when you cut that part of the brain out, you change the potential of that character. Well, that character now, doesn't have that part of the brain, then you no longer, those are constraints that you've just put on the character. That's like your World of Warcraft character. He, gets beat up by a monster of some sort, and now he only has a few hit points. Well, that's a constraint on your character. If he gets in another fight, it'll kill him because he's constrained. He's wounded. He's sick. He's whatever. He has a spell on him, So it changes things. It puts constraints on the character. So when you do a damage to the simulation in the potential, you've just changed the potential. You've changed the constraints. And now that consciousness can no longer work that part of the character because it's no longer available. It's like, well, that elf now no longer has 100 hit points. It only has 10. There's certain things, there's your constraints, certain things you can't do now. So it's not that the brain stores information or processes information. It just appears to. Because whenever you change something on the brain, you modify the potential in this virtual reality for that character to do something. And that then limits the consciousness and how they can interact and how they can respond, because they are limited to respond within the rules of the game. Just like your elf man or your sim character can only respond within the rules of the game. They can't do things that are outside the rule set of the game. So the sim characters can't just do this or do that as they will. They have to abide by the rule sets and the structure and even the social structure that's defined in the game. Okay, so they have limitations.
Unlike our evolutionary type virtual reality, the comparison to the Sims character, they're not self-modifying. We're self-modifying. We're not limited, as you said last night, to our DNA or to our set of constraints. We can modify those.
Right. Our whole point here is to grow up. And as we grow up, we change. And because we grow up as consciousness, we're a consciousness growing up and evolving. And as we evolve, then our character has to modify itself in the virtual reality to support, if you will, to justify, to mirror what we learn as consciousness. That's the sheep morality issue again. The sheep learn morality, so the brain has to modify itself to support that function. Okay? In other words, the simulation then has to modify itself to do that. Your elf learns a new skill, and because he learns that new skill, he gets a bump on his head that represents that skill. Then he gets the skill, his body changes and he gets a bump on his head or whatever. He gets purple arrows or green skin, or something happens that signifies that he has that that capability. So it's a similar sort of thing. So we don't live in a physical reality. This physical reality is not real. It's a virtual reality. It describes potential. And another way to say that, it describes constraints. So you have potential. All potential isn't just infinite potential. You have potential, but then the constraints mold that potential to within certain limits. And the constraints have to do with the rule set. But they also have to do with what we do. We can change the constraints. So if we become very fearful, and if we become trapped in beliefs, then our constraints grow. Now that character can't do things that otherwise it could do. We can change ourselves, and we can drag ourselves down, we can lift ourselves up. We can learn new things, or we can forget old things. We can de-evolve as well as evolve. So here we are playing this game, and it changes us. Okay, now that doesn't happen that much when you're playing Sims. You play the Sims, but it doesn't change you that much. Okay, because that's not the kind of game it is. You're just supposed to be entertained with the Sims. It's not really a teaching role, but we could say in some ways it is. People learn things. People become better players. They learn the ins and outs of the game. They learn how to deal with a fight, or how to deal with a bad job, or how to deal with a crying baby. That's all part of their thing. And as they learn to deal with that, they may actually learn something. They may actually kind of gain from that experience of playing a video game. And video virtual reality games that are meant to be educational, then you'll learn a lot from it. If you were in a pilot simulator, because it's just too risky and expensive to have you in a $3 billion jumbo jet and have all the engines go out. You see, you're not going to do that in a real jet someplace, because there's too much risk, too much danger, too much money. So you do that in a simulator so that you can have that experience of what happens when all the engines flame out. What do? You see, well, that's a thing that's in a reality simulator. And sure enough, you do learn a lot from those kinds of experiences. So you can learn from games. So think of it that way. We're in this game. Our players in this virtual reality, and it's within a rule set. It can only do certain things. But as it does these things, and as it makes choices, we learn from them. We, consciousness, that are the player, grow up. And our point here is to become love. That's how we're supposed to grow up. Not to become mean, or to become full of fear, or to become full of beliefs, but to let all that stuff go and become greater. So, it's a really good, it's good we have virtual realities now, because it makes it so much easier when people look at virtual reality games that they or their children play, and see that this is a similar kind of thing, except there's nobody programming all the details here. They've just evolved. In The Sims, if there's a blade of grass that you can see, some programmer had to put that blade of grass there. And it's not true here. There's a blade of grass here because it's probable that it would be here. This is a probability simulation of an evolving potential and what could be done. So this universe, our planet, us, our biology, is all part of kind of filling out the logical consequences of the original initial conditions and rule set that started in the big digital bang. We are the logical ramifications of all of that. We've evolved as a possibility. Now, there could have been other ways we evolved. There were choices, that happened. Random events happened. Something from outer space hits and creates a big cloud that shuts off the sunlight, and have extinctions, and all kinds of chance things can happen. So it's not like this is a deterministic thing. It's a statistical reality. And then here we are as a result of all that. We're here, and we make just the perfect play space, the perfect growth simulator, educational virtual reality for individuated units of consciousness to become love. That's what we're here for. So it all kind of makes sense. But that's how the soul, or the consciousness, or the spirit, depending on kind of words you use, it's how those things actually interact and become a character here. It's not that you have a soul that enters a physical body, and does this sort of thing. It's that you have a potential that a consciousness then operates within the constraints of that potential. And those constraints can change based on the choices you make.
Well, thank you. I think that added considerably to the answer that you gave to Arthur's question. You mentioned becoming love. We'll pick up from last night's interview. When you say, we talked about consequences of how we live our life, and that the goal of this reality is becoming love. Would you say the nature of this system is love? Is it the fundamental fabric of our reality, and that is why we are evolving towards love? And anything else that is counterproductive to the system is de-evolving.
That's probably a good way to say it, the fundamental fabric. It's the fundamental imperative is to change, is to evolve. And all of us have that. We have this at a deep level. There's something inside of us at the being level that says, grow up, change, be different, become more. And we're all kind of driven in that direction to do that. It's a natural thing because that's what we're here for, you see. So we have this sense of needing to improve ourselves, needing to understand, needing to grow. So
the system supports this positive growth.
Yeah, the system supports it.
Anything other than a positive growth would not be growing towards love, would be counterproductive. This is why we come into the consequences and the importance of how we should make,
right,
of how we live and how we should make good choices.
How we live and the choices we make will depend whether we evolve, de-evolve, or stay the same. We talked just about what are the consequences of staying the same. What if you just say, I don't want to play this game? Well, you can do that, but eventually you'll either make yourself useless as a potential evolver of consciousness, or you will change your mind and grow because you're stagnant and your life is not fun and you're not happy, and just doing nothing and refusing to play the game does not make you a happy player. It makes you a miserable player because what I just said earlier, you've got this innate drive inside of you to become something, to do something, to connect with other people, to share, to see all these things, connecting, sharing, helping. What are these? These are processes by which you lower entropy. These are processes by which you get rid of randomness and create content in your life, in your consciousness. So this is the lowering of entropy, and you have this kind of drive to do that. Now, though people have this drive to do that, often we take that drive and aim it at something counterproductive. This drive to become more sometimes gets perverted into a drive to become dominant, a drive to have power, a drive to be wealthy, a drive to do other things. So that's just, it's your innate drive to better yourself being perverted in a non-useful direction. But that's okay. That's part of the learning process. Making a good choice wouldn't have any particular value if you couldn't also make a bad choice. You see, that's where the free will comes in. So you have the ability to take this innate drive to better yourself and use it to damage yourself, or use it to waste your time. So you're not really evolving. You're off, making money and becoming powerful instead. And maybe you end up very powerful and very rich, but you haven't grown any. You haven't developed the quality of your consciousness. Well, that makes that incarnation a failure, not a success. Just because you were rich and powerful doesn't earn you any points, you see, because that's not what you're supposed to be doing. You took your drive, perverted it off into something that was non-useful, wasted your time. So it's that sort of thing. Yes, you can de-evolve, you can just stymie your evolution, or you can go forward. And most of us, if we're not going forward, if we're not somehow making progress toward that goal that we feel inside of us, we are dissatisfied. We're restless. It doesn't feel right. We don't like it. Of course, we blame it not on ourselves and our own choices. We blame it on everybody else. Well, it's because, my spouse doesn't do what I'd like them to do. My boss doesn't realize how brilliant I am. And we start saying that's why life is so hard. It's because all these other people don't do the kind of things I'd like them to do. That's pointing the finger outside. The reason someone is unhappy is because of what's inside. That's where the happiness or lack of it, that's where the growth or lack of it comes from inside, not from things not being right in the outside world.
We spoke before of the truly evil acts that we see in the world every day. Acts from history, acts that you see on the news every day that are truly evil. And these stem from people's lack of understanding of how things actually work. And these acts are also judged by others as, well, they're going to hell. You know, Hitler must be in hell. This kind of thing. But the consequences that you're speaking of seem to be far more serious than consistent bad choices. It seems to be that if you continue the gradual lowering of potential, that you are a candidate for deletion from the system. And this, even though hellfire and brimstone that is preached often as the punishment for those who consistently do bad acts, this is the ultimate game over.
Yes, that's true. Now, I would hasten to say that, you know, being deleted from the game is probably not something that happens a lot. It's probably a very rare circumstance, exceptionally rare circumstance, because the point is, at least at this point in this game, if you have potential, if you have the capacity to change, to grow, to be different, and of course, you know, even a Hitler or an Idi Amin or whatever despot that, you know, that was a mass murderer or whatever, that person, that's just kind of the corner that person worked them into in this particular experience packet. When they start over in another experience packet, it may turn out like that at all, you see. Some of it is just luck. You know, it could have been when Hitler did the, what they call a false flag process of burning down the Reichstag and then blaming it, you know, on his enemies, which allowed him then to kind of take over a larger part of the government. Had that not worked out, had he been found out as the one that had, you know, that had done that, well, it would have been entirely different. Instead of him taking over more of the government, he would have been thrown in the clink, tried or executed or something else, you see. So there's things that can happen. So there were all sorts of a string of things that just happened to enable a Hitler that were really outside of Hitler's control. It's not that he manipulated the whole thing. He happened to be at the right place at the right time to get a lot of support out of the German public, because it was, you know, they had been kind of pushed down from their, you know, prominence after World War I, right? And there were a lot of Germans who were looking for a little bit of glory back, like the old days sort of thing. And he hit the right time, and it was hard times, and in hard times people are looking for scapegoats. And there was a lot of fear, and economics were bad. There was a lot of disgruntlement, and people who are afraid are easy to manipulate. And then he pulled a couple of stunts, and the stunts worked, you see. So you get this whole string of things that just fell into place to put him in a position of power where he could be a mass murderer, a doer of great evil deeds, you see. Whereas any of those things didn't come together right, then it wouldn't have worked for him. He would have just been some little old guy that, you know, made shoes somewhere in, you know, an alley in Berlin, and nobody would have noticed him. He would never have been a figure of history. He would have been the disgruntled old guy that always complaining and, you know, banging his fist or something, you know, down at the corner shop. You know, and that's another point. We think about the great evil people, the mass murderers of our time, the ones who do genocide and other sorts of terrible things. But the major difference between them and, say, a lot of us, you know, the average guy, or the, you know, at least if not average, at least 1 in 10 guy, you know, or woman in our population, isn't that they were exceptionally evil in their makeup. It was that they, for one reason or another, ended up with power. And the lack of growth, the lack of love, the fact that they were driven by belief and fear and ego, they had the ability to spread that lack of growth far and wide and do huge amounts of damage. Whereas the guy in the little shop in the alley who's an old curmudgeon and fusses and bangs his fist down all the time, he doesn't have any power. The only thing he can do is maybe kick his dog when he gets home. You see, that's all he can do. Maybe all he can do is just fuss and grumble and make a lot of noises and rant and rave, but that's all he can do. So you could probably find a Hitler or, an Idi Amin or any number of the people who have done, mass crimes. You could probably find them in any group of, 50 people, any group of 100 people, anywhere on the globe, that if you gave them that kind of power, they would do those kinds of things, you see, in those kinds of times and in those kinds of circumstances. So that's the thing we have to look at. It's not that an Adolf Hitler was so consummately evil and nasty that he deserved special treatment. He actually was just probably kind of an ordinary guy who, found himself with a very unordinary amount of power. And he didn't really care much about people. He cared about power and manipulation and control. And he probably, not even so much that he disliked or hated Jews so much as that was a device that he could use to help manipulate the others to go his way. That was a scapegoat that he could blame for problems and things. So it's not so much it was a dislike as it was use the situation, need a scapegoat, need somebody to blame things on, need some way to let people vent their anger that helped him gain power. So there's lots of people who use other people, but often they're just a boss, and maybe they have 20 people that work for them, and maybe those people are generally miserable because this guy's just a real jerk. Well, would that guy do anything any differently if he could control armies and nations? Save us all from that sort of thing. So Hitler was not such an outstandingly evil person as he was somebody that reflects really what's not all that uncommon among us, who just had the power to use it in a way that made a big splash in history.
So would you be saying then that curmudgeon in the cobbler's shop, that would have been had Hitler been in that situation, is he devolving at the same rate
Sure.
as someone who was in power?
Yes, he's devolving at the same rate. You see, it's not what you do that makes a difference in your change at the being level or in your evolution. It's your intention. So if you had somebody who would burn, 1 million people, or gas, 6 million people, and they wouldn't mind doing that at all, but they don't have the power to do it, they're just as de-evolved. They're going down just as quickly as the person who would do that, and they do have the power, and they do it. You see, it's not the action that's the key ingredient. It's not what you do. It's the intent behind what you do. That's where the judgment comes, if you say. That's where the choice comes as far as growth or no growth. So yes, some people do terrible things, and that shows that they're a terrible person. But there are a lot of terrible persons who don't do massive terrible things. They do little terrible things. They harass their employees. They rant and rave at their customers. They kick their dog. They do whatever. And they are de-evolving just the same as they would if they had the power to do something massive on a historical scale that then, was history for the next 500 years. It doesn't matter. The doing isn't the point. It's the intent. So if here you are and you're a curmudgeon and we ought to nuke them, we ought to, well, you're no different than somebody who actually was able to do those things and did it. And you're devolving in just the same way. It's the quality that you are, the quality of your intent is what determines whether you evolve or de-evolve. So yeah, we pick a Hitler or an Idi Amin. Idi Amin, I don't know if you remember him or not, but he was a warlord
Yes.
somewhere in Africa, and he was a mean guy that murdered people by the thousands or by the millions. I don't remember. It's not that these are such particular cases of evil that wells up in our society. These are not that unusual people who just happen to get power and express the quality of their consciousness, okay, which is low, which is full of it's all about me and my ego and my power and what I want and my beliefs, and I'm in control and I can make anybody do what I want because I'll kill them if they don't. You see, that's not all that unusual in our culture. We see it all the time played out in little ways, in small ways, where people have the constraints that don't allow them to become, historical figures of evil doing.
Pastors preaching hate?
Sure.
Heads of religious groups preaching hate? Same things. They're on a smaller level, but it is the same thing.
Yes, it's a similar kind of thing. So it's not that, we have to not look at ourselves and say that we're all that much different. We're not. We're not all that much different. We look at these historical characters who were monsters, and we need to look at ourselves and realize, when I say ourselves, I mean we, humanity.
Yes.
Look at us and realize that that's a reflection of us. It's not that they're just this huge anomaly that just happened, and hardly anybody would ever be like that. The fact is, they're very much like us. The anomaly was that they happened to rise to enough power, enough political and military power, that they could actually do those things. That's the anomaly, not the fact that they would do those things. So it's kind of a different viewpoint. They represent us. I mean, look at the world. Look at the world. Look at all the meanness in the world. Look at all the selfishness. All the what about me? It's about mine. It goes from politics to personal relationships. Look at all of that, and that's us. The nightly news is telling us the way we are, and we express that where we can. If you don't have a dog to kick, then you don't even kick your dog. You see, you just go home and mutter. If you've got a dog, maybe you get to kick your dog. If you've got a wife and kids, maybe you get to holler at them, and berate them and tell them they're stupid or ineffectual or something. That's your way of making yourself feel better. But if you happen to be the leader of a nation with a huge army, well, you just do things differently. You do it in a much bigger way. If you're a boss, maybe you just, lord it over your employees, make them step and fetch and jump and tell them that they're inadequate. You rant and rave or do other things. So, if we look at our history and we look at our current events, that's us. That's the way we are. And the fact that some of us end up with huge power and big decisions, well, then it's just more of us, except with huge power and ability to make big decisions. They're not anomalies. The anomalous thing is their power, not their quality. You see, their quality is pretty typical. I don't necessarily would say that it's average. They may have below average quality, but they're not like rare beings either. That's
very interesting.
Yeah, that's just the nature of how we are. Again, I say this is not a graduate school for consciousness. This is an elementary school. This is not a bunch of advanced consciousness here on their last few steps to becoming love. I mean, good gracious, look out the window. Catch the news. Look at our history, and it's obvious that we're a long way from becoming love as a people. And when we talked with Bruce, he talked about how the cells had to learn to cooperate. They had to learn how to live together. The cells had to learn how to be productive. They had to work in ways that they were not competing with each other. They were all doing their own thing in their own way. And it doesn't mean that they're all equal and they all got the, whatever. It just means they all had a place, they all had a job, they all worked, and they make a whole thing work. So you have all the various kinds of cells doing specific tasks, and it's all one effort that works together. Well, see, that's a low entropy configuration of a whole lot of things working together. Well, here we are trying to do the same thing at a higher level of complication, if you will, a higher order of the simulation. Okay? It's easier at the lower levels of the simulation because the choices are not so great. Yes, those cells had choices too. They could have a choice to work as pieces of a larger organism or just stay independent little one-celled things. You see, there were choices that were made. They weren't intellectual choices, but they were choices just the same. And eventually they evolved to a point where you have I don't know, what did he say, so many billion cells or something, and they're all working cooperatively together for a specific purpose, each one doing their part. And, you know, the liver doesn't go on strike. The heart doesn't say, you know, I'm carrying the load here, guys. You know, I work all day, all night. I don't get the rest. I go, you know, love dub, and I have to work all the time. I'm taking the weekend off. You know, I'm going to stop beating for the weekend. You know, we don't have any of that sort of, what about me? You know, it's unfair to me. Look, you guys get the rest and I don't. You know, that's just ego. And these cells have all come together and they are working as a unit. And like he says, everybody gets fed, everybody gets paid, everybody has a job, you know, because and that doesn't make it some egalitarian, social, configuration. The jobs are different. Some are more important than others. You know, some are more crucial and critical than others. Some are higher paid than others. Paid in terms of energy, the amount of energy they get to use and expend, the amount of choices that they have. You get all kinds of variations of what's going on in body cells. They're all significant, but some are more significant than others. It's just the way it is. So, I mean, we could do without fingernails, but we can't do without a heart. You know, there's things that are different. So yes, it's just the way we are. And now here we are, as Bruce points out, trying to duplicate that same thing at a higher level of complication where we have a lot more choices, a lot more ways that we can go. Where those cells, they only had maybe just a couple choices. They could either do it this way or that way. Or maybe, that'd be two choices. Or maybe they had three or something. And they chose eventually through evolution of trying to lower the entropy, in other words, be more cooperative, more connected, more information, less randomness, build up more complexity. So they made those choices as they evolved into these more complex structures, which were more cooperative. Well, here we are doing the same thing. We're trying to evolve into a more complex structure that's cooperative, except all the little cells running around here are all about me. They're full of beliefs. They're limited. They can't see big pictures. They have huge egos, needs, wants, desires. But that's unfair. How could you have so much money and I don't have any? I'm at least as worthy a person as you are. I should take some of your money. You can tax it and give it to me, or I can steal it, at night while you're asleep. And we have all of this stuff that's all fear, ego, baloney, and we're having a hard time building a constructive organism out of humanity. Well, that's kind of our job. That's kind of where we're going, right? But we're not doing too well at the moment. But we've come a long way. We're probably better at it now than we were, 1,000 years ago. It's growing, but it's going to be a while yet before we get it.
So this system that is evolving towards love, because love is the direction that we naturally
Mm-hmm.
strive towards. It's the nature of the larger consciousness system. There's assistance. Now, we discussed this last night. Assistance in various forms of brought to us to help, because the system is trying to evolve positively by giving a message saying, look past yourself and look towards the larger picture of, this is why we talked about traveling out of body, what kinds of things, for certain people, it's not the same for everyone, it might be different for others, glimpses, out of body work, glimpses into reincarnation, psychic messages, visions, sometimes collective visions such as Lourdes and Fatima, your crop circles that you were speaking of, various things like that that are quote-unquote paranormal, but really are assistance from the larger consciousness system to help us grow and evolve positively.
Yes, the larger consciousness system has a great incentive for us to succeed because we are it and it is us. In other words, we are pieces of this system. We're just individuated units of consciousness that are parts of the system. We make up the system. So the system is us, and we're it. If we succeed, it succeeds. If any human being, say, or any sheep, or any monkey, or any dog, increases the quality of its consciousness, then the average of the whole system ticks up just a tiny little bit. And the whole system evolves by all of these little personal tick-ups in quality of consciousness, all adding together. That's how the system evolves. So we are its strategy. And not only us, when I say we are, I don't mean we exclusively are. There are other reality frames. There's other things going on. But we here in this particular reality frame, what we are doing is we are units of consciousness who have limited ourselves to experience, limited a part of ourselves to experience within this virtual reality so we can make choices and speed our evolution. It's an evolutionary training device, if you will, this physical universe, this virtual reality we're in. So the system has every reason for us to want to help us succeed, but it can't do it for us or there's no success. Something doesn't evolve because a big hand reaches down to the board and moves a piece. You see, you have to move it yourself. You have to evolve at the individual level. Consciousness is individual. So each little individuated unit of consciousness contributes to the evolution of the whole. So the whole wants us to succeed. So the whole does give us lots of help. And we find this help, like you say, in all the things that you listed, are there. Those are kind of wake-up calls, a little sprinkle of water in the face, a little slap maybe to wake up. But we also, most people have had such experiences as, that would be called paranormal. And paranormal doesn't mean anything spooky. It just means that normal, traditional science doesn't have an explanation for it. Well, there's lots of things that you would expect traditional normal science not to have an explanation for. Traditional normal science doesn't have all the answers. There's a lot to learn yet, right? There's much that they don't understand. And let's go back to, 300 years ago. What did traditional, science know then? What didn't they know? Well, they didn't know almost anything about our, the way we live now. They didn't know anything about computers and automobiles and networks, and none of that stuff was known. So a computer then would have been paranormal, would have been beyond, what science could think about or what could work. A color television, a radio would have been paranormal. You see, all these things were beyond normal. That's what para means, beyond normal. They don't flow logically out of normal. Normal means today's traditional science. Well, that's not because there's something spooky about these events. That's because traditional science is still ignorant about a whole lot of things, which is the whole point of my big toe, a different view of science in which all these things make sense, rather than the view in which these things are para and beyond science. The experiments at Para Labs are all paranormal in the sense that normal science won't explain them. Same with all the experiments that Dean Radin does, and J.D. Ryan did, and all of this stuff is all listed paranormal, not because of any particular attribute of its own, but simply because the limited physics of our time can't explain it. Well, let's not say that the paranormal stuff is goofy because we believe that the physics is complete. Why don't we say that the unknown that's beyond our normal understanding is just because the traditional science is ignorant? What's wrong with that view? They just don't know yet how to explain that. Well, with my big toe, there is a logical science that does explain that. And that's the way it normally works with Newtonian physics. Now, there was a logical science with Newtonian physics that explained all kinds of things, like the motion of all the heavenly bodies and the stars moving across the sky. And it turned out they really weren't being drawn by angels in chariots attached to the stars and the moon and all that kind of stuff. That wasn't right. It was a simple equation, that the gravitational force, GMM over R square, right, where G is the gravitational constant. That explained it all. Just that one equation of Newton's explained how everything worked. So you can't say, well, this, the paranormal is a bunch of goofy woo-woo people that are all hallucinating, instead of saying, well, the paranormal reflects a whole bunch of facts that science can't explain, but perhaps science will change and evolve one day to be able to explain those. See, that's a more rational approach, rather than the approach, well, we of science know everything. We're omniscient and we know it all, and these things don't fit, therefore they're goofy and wrong, and anybody that thinks they're like that is goofy and wrong and having a hallucination. See, that's a supreme arrogance, that I know everything, and if this isn't part of what I know, then obviously it's wrong and doesn't exist. Just a supreme arrogance that takes that view, rather than, well, these things now for the last 50 or 60 years have been studied very carefully by very good scientists and have shown to exist. Therefore, we scientists don't understand everything that there is to understand. There's more to reality than what we know of, and we need to modify our models so that we can understand these things and make them rational, make them to where they are. We understand how they work and why they work that way. Not just some kind of metaphor for them, or not just admitting that they exist, but actually understanding how and why they work, and seeing that they are just as repeatable and just as rational and just as explainable as anything else. You see, now that would be a more intelligent way of approaching the problem, rather than I know everything, and if this isn't part of what I know, it's got to be wrong, and you people who think it's true got to be crazy, got to be wackos, no credibility, because we know everything. See, when you put it in those words, it's obviously just arrogance beyond belief. But we tend to get that way. We tend to believe that we know everything is the problem. So I guess we wandered a bit from your question.
No, we didn't. To the listeners out there, the science has arrived that explains the big picture outside of conventional physics, and that is your book, My Big Toe.
Well, the point of My Big Toe is to explain, the subjective. The subjective world is also explainable, and our science says no, subjective world is not explainable. It changes based on the whim of the subject. And while that's true, that doesn't mean it isn't explainable. It's just not explainable in terms of deterministic worldview, you see. And then, of course, the traditional science, if it's not part of a deterministic worldview, if it's not this clockwork process, then it can't be real. But we know that most of our life is not clockwork process. Most of our decisions are not logical. Most of what matters to us, love, affection, cooperation, integration with others, satisfaction, none of these things are clockwork processes. So most of what is important to us is covered or has any understanding of how it fits and why it is, from our traditional science. Our traditional science says, well, these things are non-scientific. Well, that's another way of saying we don't understand the science that explains these things. But they would never admit that. They would just say it's non-scientific. There's some things that, just science just doesn't apply to them. They'll never be scientific. Nobody will ever know. Well, that's just a confession of ignorance, and then claiming that nobody will ever know excuses you from being ignorant. Well, it's not me that I'm ignorant. Nobody will ever know. It sounds like quantum mechanics guys, right? I mean, nobody will ever understand how the double slit works. That's just impossible. Well, that's just ignorance, claiming that ignorance is okay, because nobody will ever know. It's justifying ignorance. So that's not the case. You can understand all the subjective. You can understand all the paranormal. It does make logical sense. It is part of a larger theory that unites, the metaphysical and the physical. So that's the point of all of this, is a bigger science that explains the whole thing.
Of course. One of the other subjects that we touched on last night were aliens. Now, I use that word. It's a word we use for other than here, but it is information. It is information from other virtual realities. Accessing them is something like when you travel out of body, you can access these different realities. It's really the same sort of benefits that you would get traveling here. It opens your mind to the nature of the larger consciousness system, and the variety of ways it refines and evolves itself towards the goal of love. I think it's sort of if you're exposed to, there's more than my hometown, there's the capital city, there's the state, there's the country, there's other countries. What else is there? There's always that question of what more is there? And as you see more, experience more of other cultures, the value is you're open to simply more understanding. And I think that's the same with accessing these other virtual realities. As you have done, you've accessed dozens of other realities. These are just the same as here, some physical, again, that's the terminology there is from the viewpoint, but they have their individual systems. The value, I think, and I wonder what your experience has taught you, the value, I think, of tapping into these other realities is, what are their constraints? What are their challenges? How do they structure this reality so that these beings can learn the way we're learning? And you get a much broader perspective of how this whole system is.
Okay.
How could you comment on that?
There's a bunch of comments that as you were talking I was trying to remember to say. One of them is that, yes, we can define an alien as not from here. In other words, not an earthling. Anything that didn't evolve on this planet then is called an alien, which would take everything, and it could be everything that's also in this virtual reality, within this universe, but not from Earth, as well as everything that has nothing to do with this universe in different reality frames. All of those then would become aliens, whether they were just part of this universe, other suns, other planets in this universe, or whether it was outside of this universe, other reality frames. See, most people can't think of outside this universe and other reality frames. That's a thought that's too big. That doesn't compute. It's like, what? What's that mean? Oh, that's garbage, or that doesn't make any sense, or whatever. But they're limited by their beliefs to only within this universe, which means other planets, other reality, other planets, other suns, and so on, within this particular virtual reality. But that's not true. It's just because they're limited by their beliefs doesn't mean that the reality is limited by their beliefs. There are lots of other reality frames as well as this universe. So if we call all of those aliens, then that's a real large conglomeration of different kinds of beings that might exist to which we can interface with. And it is true that if you're more well-traveled, you have a bigger perspective. And the reason that works is that we tend to model the world on ourselves. We tend to think everybody else is sort of like us. So you grow up in a small town and you have certain attitudes and ideas of the way the world works. What's right, what's wrong, what's proper behavior, what isn't, and you have these ideas. You see, and as far as you're concerned, that's the way the world should be. That's the only world you know. So you pattern the world on what you know. Well, that's really no fault in that. You can't do anything else but pattern the world on what you know. Well, now you travel to a different culture and you see that people do things very differently. And if you're open-minded, you realize that it's just different. It's not worse. It's not uncivilized because they eat with chopsticks instead of a knife and fork. You see, it's just different. And that there are these different customs and different ways of looking at the world, and they may have a whole different worldview, kind of a different ethic, a different sense of how reality works. And you realize that, well, that's just another perspective. That's another culture's way of looking at the same things I looked at. And suddenly, your little ego, patch of turf, in the little town you grew up in, now has to include other things as possibilities. You found different ways of looking at the world. And they don't seem to be wrong or bad, they just seem to be different. Well, that gives you a bigger perspective. Whereas before, you couldn't think outside of this box, now your box is bigger. You see, and then you go and for a while live among people who are starving to death. You go to some place where there's famine, and you visit the camps where food's being passed out, and you go places like that, and that'll teach you a compassion that you never had before, because in your little town everybody was well fed, everybody had a house, everybody had a job, everybody was doing fine, and there was none of that. You didn't realize that was even going on in the world, or maybe you saw pictures, but they're just pictures. When you're there and you're a part of it, it's different. Now perhaps you have a compassion for people that you never had before, because compassion wasn't really compassion in your old thing meant that, somebody liked to have a new pair of shoes. Their old ones weren't quite worn out yet, but they were no longer stylish. You say, well, that's kind of a different amount of compassion, and compassion about all these children and their mothers and fathers that are all starving to death. It's kind of a different degree of compassion altogether. So traveling broadens your sense of what are the possibilities. It broadens your reality. So instead of living in a little reality based on a little bit of experience, you live in a bigger reality based on a much bigger experience. The larger your reality is, the larger your choices are. So if you have a big perspective, you kind of look and say, well, here's something that happened. Here's stuff happens. What am I going to do? Well, you now have maybe 100 choices instead of just 10, because you've seen how lots of other people might deal with that same kinds of things from other cultures, other ways of looking at it, and it broadens your reality, which broadens your choices, which broadens the scope of your free will, and you become an expanded awareness. You see, your awareness is expanding. And when you take that further to exploring the larger reality, then again, it broadens your awareness. Oh, there's all kinds of life. It's not just our reality system. There's virtual realities here and here and here, and they're all doing similar kinds of things, but doing them differently. Why is that? What are the similarities? What are the differences? What are significant about the differences? What can I learn from those differences? And you get another perspective. So yes, all of that is helpful in your growing up and becoming instead of a citizen of, say, a country here, instead of being a citizen of the US or a citizen of Japan, you become a citizen of the world because you're well traveled. And then you grow up and become maybe a citizen of the universe because you communicate with other entities that are part of this universe. And then maybe you become a citizen of, the larger reality in consciousness. And all of those expand your general awareness, give you a larger reality to live in, and you learn to live in those realities. You don't just live here. Your mind takes you other places. You learn to parallel process. You begin to live in multiple realities at the same time. That's kind of the nature of life. And one of the things comes to mind, we sit here and we do this talk, and we were joking about it last night, that we were sitting here talking with each other, and we didn't, we were stuttering and couldn't seem to pronounce the words right. And part of that, on mine, I have people write in and say, were you drunk? You were slurring your words. And it's like, well, no, actually, what's going on is when I'm having these interviews, I'm probably only about 30% in this physical reality frame. I'm elsewhere most of the time, gathering information, putting the words together, trying to understand all of the minds that are going to listen. How is it that I can put it together in such a way that more people will understand it better? So I'm doing all this processing while the mouth is talking and gathering information at the same time and trying to, put it together, that because I'm only 30% in this physical reality, I don't work my body quite as well as I would have. I'm not quite as coordinated. I don't speak as clearly. My lips get a little heavy and thick, And also when you talk for 3 hours, your lips kind of dry out and they do get a little heavy and thick. But that's part of it. It's because I'm only partially here when I do this. If I had to give these talks and these interviews all from my intellect, if I was just working out of my intellect and I was 100% here in this physical reality working out of my intellect, it would be awful. It just would be awful. I wouldn't have the scope or the breadth to explain things such that other people look at it and see big pictures. Everything would be sliced and diced, and it would be more intellectual process. It would be more left brain. The right brain isn't as tightly, closed in as the left brain, but I'm not. So that's why sometimes I don't pronounce words very clearly, because I'm not really, but a small percentage of me here manipulating the physical body that has to move its lips and talk. So it
feel bad.
It gets and the further out I get, if I get to where I'm only 10% here, then my eyes tend to kind of glaze too, and I don't look like I'm really focused on anything. That would be another sign that you get, but it's not because...
That's Dennis's famous quote of the 1,000-foot stare. I think we quoted him on describing one of your experiences as the 1,000-foot stare that you get. Something like that. Anyway, don't feel bad. I stumbled over a lot of questions.
I have a lot of people that tell me that because because I'm not entirely here. I'm doing other things, other places, and I'm gathering information, and I will sometimes just let my body go on auto. In which case I might just never blink, and just kind of stare.
That's the one.
And after a while, people feel a little uncomfortable with that, and it makes them feel uncomfortable that I'm not blinking and I'm staring at them, when actually I'm not staring at them at all. It's just the position I left my body in, and it just doesn't have a signal to do anything else.
You're pulling information from all of these other sources. Tom, in your vast experience of accessing other realities, I think I may know the answer to this, but I'd like to know what you think from your experience. Are other beings in these other realities struggling as much with beliefs, fears, and egos as we are? Are their challenges much the same?
Yes. They're not. They're not the same, because their whole social situations are sometimes very different. Their bodies are sometimes very different. It's a different rule set. But in general, if you just look at the part that matters, from the big picture look, it's exactly the same. So the details aren't exactly the same, but at the bigger picture, yes, it's exactly the same. They're struggling. They're trying to learn to become love and not doing a very good job of it. There's lots of ego, there's lots of control, power, force, what about me? It's the same sort of thing, because that's the nature of consciousness. That's how consciousness grows up. It lets go of fear. Love is letting go of fear. You get rid of ego, you get rid of belief, you get rid of fear, and all the other things. Fear creates these things. Like ego is a creation of fear. And a lot of belief is a creation of fear. Not all belief, but quite a lot of it is a creation of fear. The expectations, That's creation of fear. So fear is the big thing. You get rid of the fear and you get rid of all the stuff drops away. And what do you have left after the fear is gone? Love. You see? So it's not like becoming love is this thing, this magic thing you somehow have to figure out how to do. What you have to do is get rid of the fear. You know, get rid of the expectations, get rid of the ego, get rid of the beliefs. When you get rid of all that limiting stuff that gets in your way, you are love. You see, you've arrived, you've done that. So sometimes people get the idea that this becoming love is they want a prescription on how to do that. You know, what steps do I take to do that? But the steps you have to take is yourself. You have to get rid of the bad habits. You have to get rid of the fear that you have. And then you are love. Love is fearless. Love has no expectations. You know, love requires no belief. You know, love has to be freely given. You know, it's this sort of thing. So that's the idea in becoming love is really letting go all the things that blocking you from expressing and being that love. So you have that potential in you, but it's just potential. You're not there yet. You have to, through experience, learn. Your elf has to, through experience, learn how to become a level 60 whatever in its game, right? It needs to do that, and it can only do that through experience. You can't buy your level 60, you know. Well, you can, I guess you can in those games. You can buy a character that's already had the experience to work it up to level 60, but you only get level 60s or 65s or 70s or whatever it is these days that's the top of the game through experience. Nobody can do it for you. So that's the game.
That brings us to, thank you. I think that brings us to one more comment that we were speaking about judgments against other evil that's going on, evil people, evil deeds, looking outside and saying, well, you know, I'm not like that. But really what you have to do is only look at yourself. I think that is one of your primary statements in your My Big Toe, coming from the subjective part of your theory that the only thing that you can change is yourself, and that judgment on anything else outside is really futile and non-productive.
Non-productive for your own growth. Now we do have to judge, you know, we do have to judge certain things because we have to interact in the world, and we have to make guesses, and we have to project, and we have to say, well, that guy who, you know, had the real greasy hair and was telling us that this car was owned by a little old lady that never drove it over 35 mile an hour, you know. And though it's 20 years old, it only has 5,000 miles on it, and it got rust all over it, and so on. You know, maybe I don't trust them. Maybe I should go someplace else. Or maybe I should be very careful about getting a mechanic to look at that car. You see, that's making a judgment, right? You kind of come to those judgments, and we make those because we have to interact all the time.
Or discernment, maybe.
Yeah, we're discernment. But we do that. And to some extent, you know, that's okay. But once that becomes prejudicial, you see, once you're no longer making it based on probability, if you're just looking at the probabilities and making a decision, then that's like doing the best you can to get along in a very confusing and sometimes violent and unpleasant place. But when it becomes not a matter of looking at the probabilities and looking at the data, it becomes a matter of just prejudice. Oh, look at that guy, you know, he has this skin color, can't trust him. He's probably a thief, you see. Now you've gone past the point of it being useful into the part of it being harmful. It's no longer just the data. Now it's a belief, you see. From doing an analysis, a rational analysis of the data and looking at the probabilities and saying, oh, this is a bad part of town. There's a lot of crime here. I don't think we ought to drive through there tonight. I think we ought to go around, you see. That's probably a rational decision to make. But to say, oh, so-and-so came from that neighborhood, therefore they're probably a criminal, you see, that is not a rational decision to make. One is looking at statistics of an area and making a decision where to drive. The other is painting a person with the attributes of the area he comes from. That may or may not be true, you see. Now we've got a belief. We have a prejudice, and that is wrong. So it's a little tricky in to say, well, don't ever make any judgments. Well, we do have to make some judgments, but we have to make them without belief, without the prejudice, without the ego, without the fear, all of it. We can get rid of all of that, then our judgments are basically just being rational. It's looking at the data and being rational. So the judgments we want to get rid of are judgments of, like you were bringing up, comparison. Oh, I'm better than that person. I'm more loving than them. This guy's really evil. I don't want to hang around with him. We make these kinds of judgments, and they're mostly ego, belief, and fear. And if that's where we're coming from, then the judgment is just wrong, and it drags us down and is not useful whatsoever. Well, most people live their lives based on fear, ego, and belief. I mean, that's what drives most of us to do what we do. For the average person walking around in this learning lab, fear, belief, and ego make up probably 99% of all their motivations for doing anything. The way they treat their children, the way they treat their spouse, how they work, how they relate to their coworkers, their boss. I mean, everything. They're driven by fear. From their religion to their jobs, to their families. It's fear, ego, belief, expectations, needs, wants, desires. It's all of that stuff is what drives it. Well, that's the problem. So for somebody who makes 99% of their decisions based on that, then it's a fair thing to say is stop making judgments. See, judgments are wrong. Give up making judgments. And that's a fair thing to say because that's generally true. But it's not necessarily has to be true. You can make judgments. You have to make judgments about, do you drive through this neighborhood? Okay, we got out of the movie, it's midnight, we're going to drive through central LA tonight through this neighborhood. Well, probably not a good idea, particularly if you're driving in a BMW, with leather seats. Probably a bad idea. And so judgments aren't bad by themselves. It's just judgments based on fear are bad. And that's true of anything, not just judgments. When we tell our mind to settle down, when we learn how to meditate, the thing we have to stop doing, we call it, quieting the monkey mind, right? It's that monkey mind that's chattering. Well, what that monkey mind is doing is analyzing and judging. It's judging. Am I doing this right? Is this working? Am I in a meditation state? Oh, it's not working. Oh, I must not be doing it right. Well, maybe I should say my mantra quicker, or maybe I should say it slower, or maybe I should think it harder. Maybe I should try harder, you see. And we start second guessing, judging, analyzing, and it's this litany of monkey mind jabber that prevents us from ever getting in a meditation state. You see, that's the stuff we want to, tell it to sit down and be quiet. And that's what people have a hard time doing. They immediately start analyzing it. And we talked yesterday, as soon as somebody makes contact with something outside of them, the very next second it's, was that real? Was that me? What did it mean? I can't tell. I don't know whether that was me or not. And then you get all wadded up in this stuff, and they've just killed the opportunity to learn something, see, by their constant judging. So we tend to say when we're talking about blanket advice, no judgments, no this, but that does confuse people because people say, well, you have to make some judgments. You need discernment. You need to be able to, look at the situation and decide what's a smart move and what's not. So being loved doesn't mean becoming an idiot. You see, that's the thing. Some people get into that. Well, if I became love, I'd be this mumbling idiot who, had nothing to say and couldn't talk, couldn't think. I'd just be experiencing love, and I'd turn into a rock, right? A happy rock. And it's not like that at all. That's not the point. And people think to be detached. When you're detached, that means removed, aloof, no longer connected. No. Being detached means you're not attached to your ego. You're not attached to your fear. See, that's what we mean by being attached. It's not that you can't be compassionate. It's not that you can't care deeply. You can be detached and care deeply. Those two are not mutually exclusive. You see, but people have a hard time with those kinds of distinctions, so they're worth talking about a little bit. So yes, you can be completely detached. That just means there's no ego, fear, belief at the root of your intentions. You're not working out of that stuff. And that's what people mean when they say you have to be completely detached. They don't mean you have to let go of your sense of reality or sense of community or sense of caring for another individual. Now you're detached. You're above it all. You're just floating through life, and you neither care nor not care for anything. You see, it's the wrong idea. It's not that way it is. So yes, you should stop the judgment, stop the chatter, but realize that, we're only saying that in a sense that is good advice for most people. Just cut that out, because most of what you do is that. And that's what prevents you from meditating. It's all that chatter coming from the ego, the fear, and the beliefs. So, yes, it is important to let that go. It's important to understand the source of your problem is you. It's not somebody else. And if you have to make comparisons, am I doing it right? Listen, this happened to me. Is that okay? I think I'm probably a lot more loving now than I was 6 months ago. What do you think? Well, all of that's okay. You do need some feedback. You do need to ask these questions, but it's still your ego. It's like you've heard the old saying, inquiring minds want to know. Inquiring egos want to know. Is probably a better, more accurate saying. Inquiring egos want to know, am I doing it right? Is that really somebody I'm talking to, or is that just me? See, an inquiring ego needs to know these things. Because if it's just me, then I'm being a fool. If it's somebody else, then gee, I'm excited, but how can I tell? Well, I can't tell. Oh, I'm paralyzed now with confusion and inability to go forward. You see, it's that sort of thing, because inquiring egos want to know. Did you ever go back and look at, Albert Einstein or, so-and-so, historical figures? Wouldn't it be neat to go and have a chat with them? And it's like, well, why? Well, inquiring egos would like to know what it was like. But there's very little to be gained from that, because growth has to come from inside you. It's not about somebody else. It's not about understanding somebody else's viewpoint. It's not about memorizing my big toe. It's not about believing anything I say. None of that's going to help you grow up. Expanding your world, that's good. But you don't have to travel in the outer body or do remote viewing or do lucid dreaming to grow up. That's really not the point either. You don't even have to travel. You could stay in the same town you were born in and never leave, Podunk, Oklahoma, if you want to. You could do that, and you could grow up there. And you could become love there. It would be a different path. That you could do that there, perhaps through the path of service. Would be a way that you could do that without travel, without expanding your awareness. There's there's several paths to get to this. If you take the warrior's path, or the path of knowledge, then it's very helpful, because expanding your awareness expands your knowledge, expands your worldview, expands your picture, and things start making sense. And on the path of knowledge things making sense is how you get there. You learn, you grow, you understand. And we Westerners, we in Western culture, you and I and most everybody we know, that's our natural path, because we in the Western world tend to be left brain dominant, and we want to know, we want to understand. It has to make sense to us. And if it doesn't make sense to us, we can't go there. It's like if I don't know that the person I'm talking to is not me, then I can't continue to talk to them. See, we can't go unless we have left brain connection to the process. It's just the way we are in this culture. Other cultures are different. They don't have to do that. They can walk right into mystical understanding without ever having the left brain get connected to it, because their culture supports that. Ours does not. You're an idiot if you do that in our culture. you're a woo-woo, right-brain, space cadet in our culture if you take that path. So most people in our path don't do that. They want the path of knowledge. And in the path of knowledge, then, if that's your path, you're much better off to travel, to get out of Kansas or wherever and view the larger reality, to travel around this planet and to travel outside of this universe. It gives you a bigger reality and a bigger perspective. But that's more localized to this path. So you can get people who do very well and who are very grown up, and they maybe have never lived any place other than that one house their whole life, but they still grow up anyway. So my point is, it's not necessary to do these things, but it's helpful if you happen to be of a mind frame and a culture where your natural path is through the path of knowledge. Then it becomes very valuable.
There are many paths and one goal, would you say?
Yeah, many ways to go there. Even within each path, there's many ways. So even through just the path of knowledge, there's 100 different ways you can take within that. And then there's the path of service, and then there's the path of surrender. The path of surrender is a path that is typically what we would call a religious path. Okay, the Western religions have kind of migrated a little bit from that, but basically we look at maybe the Hindu or Buddhist, where if you're on a serious religious path, you become a monk. You go sit in a monastery. You surrender yourself to the higher power, sort of thing. That's the path of surrender. That doesn't happen too much in Western cultures because that's a low value activity in the West. It can be the highest value activity elsewhere, but here it's not. So we don't have a whole lot of Westerners taking the path of surrender. We may have an example, say Mother Teresa. That was probably a path of service. Her main thing was helping others. It wasn't converting others, preaching to others, explaining things to others, intellects on the path of knowledge. It was just service, period. My guess is, I didn't know Mother Teresa, but from what I've read, I would say she had very little use for dogma and rules, and here's the way we do it, and here's the way we see it, and you need to believe this. I don't think that was her strong suit. I think her strong suit was, here's where I can help. Here's where I can be of service, period. The rest of it wasn't that important. The service was important. And you have those who, like the Dalai Lama, who are obviously the path of surrender. They have given themselves up to something bigger than themselves, and they grow through that, through that process. Although the Dalai Lama is probably well-traveled, as any being here, he goes all over this planet and, talking and interacting with people. So he's active at the left brain part of it. And he also, is in charge of certain amounts of service and, that they do. So you don't have to just pick one and stick with it. You can be part of all of the, it's not like you pick a path and it's one of these three. It can be all of these three. It can be bits and pieces of them tied together in interesting ways. There's infinite number of paths to the same conclusion.
Even though the Dalai Lama is connected with a certain religion, he recently was quoted, and I have to paraphrase it because I don't know the exact quote, as saying that we need to look above religion, or this world is not going to be on an evolving path. It's really paraphrasing, but we have to look outside of religion, I think was the gist of the quote. And that was interesting, I think.
Yes, it's absolutely correct. And here just like you have a Mother Teresa who's applying the path of service within a structure, the Catholic religion, that has all sorts of structure and beliefs and things to swear to. But that really wasn't that important to her. It was the service. You see, well, now you have a Dalai Lama who's on the path of surrender, and he's surrendered, and he is one with the greater reality because he's surrendered himself to it, and he's learned a lot, and so here he is, this very wise man, but he's not really tied to the to the concept of religion. He's saying we got to rise above it. And the reason he says we have to rise above it is he realizes that all over the world, when you say the word religion, it's not about surrendering to a higher power. It's about structure and dogma and belief, creed. You know, it's a belief thing. And belief is the problem. Belief goes in there with fear. You know, you have all these people tied up to, I'm right, you're wrong. You know, my beliefs are right, your beliefs are wrong. You will go to hell, I won't. You know, you have all this, I'm better than you are. Well, that's just ego and fear talking and belief. So we need to get rid of that. So he sees that. He sees that religion, quote unquote, isn't the kind of mystical attachment to the larger reality as he sees it. To a lot of people, to most people, it's a belief set of a bunch of, you know, dogma. Well, and he's saying that's not helping people. We need to get above this attachment to a bunch of dogma. That's holding us back. That's limiting us in what we can see and understand. So you see, it's natural for him to come to that conclusion, but it's a little startling because here's the guy who's primarily, more than anything else, a religious figure, right? And he's saying, we got to let go of that. He doesn't mean that we need to let go of our surrender to the larger, you know, power, the larger system. That's not what he's talking about. He's saying we need to let go of religion. We need to let go of the creed, of the dogma, of the stuff that makes us dislike and hate each other, and all that negative, you know, ego junk and fear is what we have to get rid of. And that happens to be what most people think of when they think of religion. It's not about the surrender. It's about my dogma, you know, my dogma can beat up your dogma, you know. It's that kind of a childish, you know, ego sort of approach. So that's what he said, and it's a very, you know, it was a wonderful thing for him to say, because I'm sure it made a whole lot of people think. Here's probably today one of the most, you know, primary symbols of religious activity is the Dalai Lama. I mean, everybody respects the Dalai Lama. Whatever your faith is, the Dalai Lama is obviously a wise man. He speaks of peace and love and nothing else. You know, that's what he talks about, coming together, you know, being one. So it's all, you know, all the things he says, it's hard for anybody to disagree with. So he's kind of held at world renown, right, as a piece of wisdom, as a man of wisdom and understanding. And for him to say that was extremely enlightening, I think, probably for lots of people.
Yes, it is. And I think on that high note, we will end the interview. And thank you very much, Tom.
You're quite welcome. It's been a pleasure, Donna.
Thank you.